listen. But what I thought that I would do is just show a few of the documents from our archives that animate this story, and then we'll hear from our panelists, who I'll introduce to you briefly now, and we're really pleased to have them and pleased to have their participation in the creation of the podcast as well. So first, we have John Efron, the Koret Professor of Jewish History in the Department of History and Director of Institute for European Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He's also a member of the Leo Baeck Institute Academic Advisory Board, and he's published many books about German Jewish history. The two of his earlier books in particular are closely linked to the story that we tell in this podcast. Defenders of the Race from 1994 is a history of Jewish scientists' participation in the research and discourses of race science. And Medicine in the German Jews in 2001 is a history, of course, of German Jews in the medical profession. Veronica Liphart is a historian of science at the University of Freiburg, and she's worked on the history of life sciences in the 20th century, particularly the history of physical anthropology and human population genetics. And she's written extensively about William Nussbaum in particular, including in her monograph from 2008. I'll translate the German title, Biology of the Jews, Jewish Scientists on Race and Heredity, 1900 to 1935. And so she probably knows this story better than anyone, and also became close with the Nussbaum family while researching in these files at LBI, and I think perhaps even before they were at LBI. So we're very lucky to have her, especially because she's joining us from Germany, where it's quite late. And finally, we have Peter Nussbaum, an attorney and the grandson of William and Lotta Nussbaum. So thank you for joining us, Peter.
My pleasure.
If I can, I'll just show, I'll try to breeze through a few of these images because I think it really gives a sense of how this story is connected to what's in our archives. And I'll start the slideshow. Can everyone see that on their screens?
Yep.
Okay, so this is a really special story for a lot of reasons. And one of them is that it is so extraordinarily well documented in such an enormous and well-organized collection. So there are just thousands of pages of correspondence, of research files, and also photographs organized in two collections with dozens of boxes of material. It's really astonishing. I mean, there are a few other collections of this sort of breadth and depth in the LBI archives, but this one is really singular, I think. And one of the things that we have is pictures of William and Lotta Nussbaum. So you see them on the left on a street in Germany. I believe this is a wedding photo, although I couldn't find a caption, in the center, and then at their 55th wedding anniversary on the right. And here's a young William Nussbaum in either in an office at a clinic or in a laboratory. And another thing that we have is, in addition to photographs are actually not a very major part of the collection, but we have just an enormous amount of correspondence. And both William and Lotta Nussbaum were very active correspondents with one another, with friends, and with, I mean, they were both intellectuals and corresponded with a great number of people. But I think one of the most sort of endearing things about the collection is the correspondence between them, which is mentioned in the podcast. particularly when they were separated, when William went to the US, they wrote to one another sometimes 2 times a day. And there was actually a little part in the podcast that we cut out just for time, where we went through a long list of the sort of terms of endearment that William would start his letters with, which were quite sweet and often sort of mushy. He sent poetry. You can see a poem that he sent to Lotte Nussbaum on the right. And at some point, they started corresponding in English, obviously working on their English in preparation for emigration to the US.
David, that picture on the prior slide was my father and my grandmother getting on the boat to take him to the United States in the lower left hand. It's mentioned, Andy mentions it in the narrative.
Yeah.
Lower left hand corner, that's Lotte, and then the little boy is my dad.
Oh, it's the lower left.
Yeah.
Okay. See, I was looking at the people on the stairs already, but that's your father, Bernard. Is that right? Okay. So that would have been August 1936.
Yep.
Another remarkable thing about William Nussbaum was that he was also an artist and a poet. So we have a number of oil paintings. I think Peter said that some of the best ones are still with the family, but here's a self-portrait on the left and a drawing of Lotte on the right. And the lives of their 2 sons, Bernard and Michael, are also represented in the collection. And you can tell what a close family they were. I think maybe some of those letters I just showed give you a sense of that, but also how concerned they were about the fate of their children. And much of the correspondence from this early period is all about, you know, the impossibility of letting the children grow up in Germany, the sort of, you know, lack of a future there, and this intractable problem of how to get Michael over. And then, of course, the other part of the story that makes up a very large part of the collection is William's research, and particularly the study, the sort of anthropometric and hereditary studies of German Jewish communities. So there are many boxes full of these forms. This is a blank form, and then there's a picture that was attached to the back of one of the forms. Most of the forms are suppressed because they contain sort of personal medical information, but there are, you know, records on thousands of members of Jewish communities that were done as part of his research project, and they're in the collection at Leo Baeck Institute. And this is kind of a difficult and complicated story that I hope we managed to tell in a compelling way that gets at the nuances of it. But one important thing to realize is that William Nussbaum's research project got a lot of support, including within the Jewish community. So here's a relatively positive article about his studies on Jewish children in the CV Zeitung, which was like the major, the publication of the major Jewish civil rights group in Germany. And it's talking about his efforts to go around to different Jewish communities and do these measurements of children. And there are also some photos of these examinations. And occasionally these will pop up on you know, websites about race science and the Holocaust and Nazi race science in particular. And occasionally we write to organizations that have posted them in a sort of well-meaning way, but not realizing that these are actually pictures of Nussbaum's measurements. So you can see the number on the girl's shirt here, where she's being photographed, and a colleague of mine in the archives, I was actually able to verify that it was her by finding her in the files. And another thing, since we're the Leo Baeck Institute, I thought it would be interesting to see William Nussbaum's correspondence with Leo Baeck, who was also supported his initiatives And here's a letter from Nussbaum to Baeck. And then here's a letter from Baeck to the Central Relief Committee in New York, basically endorsing William Nussbaum's work, and kind of, it's like a letter of reference, and he asks the Central Relief Committee to help Nussbaum. And then another interesting and complicated part of the story that I hope we get to talk with our experts about a little bit is that it was Franz Boas, the cultural anthropologist at Columbia, who brought William Nussbaum over to the United States. And Franz Boas was actually engaged in this work of physical anthropology and cultural anthropology and kind of measuring human difference. But he was also a vocal opponent of scientific racism, and the fact that he wanted to work with Nussbaum, especially given Nussbaum's sort of academic pedigree at the university in Berlin, was very interesting and complicated. So that's just a tiny glimpse into what we have in the archives about this extraordinary family. And we're very lucky to have a few members of the family with us tonight. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask Peter Nussbaum for just a personal sense of your grandfather. I understand that you knew him quite well, and we've heard this long and complicated story, but of course you grew up knowing him as your grandfather, and I'm wondering if you can talk about just how you remember him and your mother as people.
So, they lived in Kew Gardens and then in Lake Grove, and we were in Chicago. So we didn't see them growing up. We didn't see them, terribly often. I'd say maybe 1 or 2 weeks a year. And as a young child, I found his accent almost a little bit scary, but then later on, he was actually very sort of philosophical. He had a good sense of humor. One of the things I remember, they would eat, my grandmother would cook meals, and then at the end of the meal, Poppy would ask everybody to pass the plates down to him, and he'd stack them up, and she would always yell at him, "I married a busboy. I married a busboy." And so, but they had a very, sort of loving relationship, and basically every day they'd watch the sunset through the trees out the picture window of their little Lake Grove house. He enjoyed swimming. He went to Jones Beach until he was probably 80, 85 and swam in the water, or bobbed, probably is a better way of saying it. And, and then later when I went to college, probably I started going there a little bit more often as a junior and then through law school. And, we would sit and talk, and he was constantly reading medical literature. He had a stack of magazines by his chair, and he just sort of plow through them, and they were all, medical stuff that I didn't really understand. And later in life, like in the early 40s, they became religious. So he was either always reading a medical journal or the Torah or something, some religious thing. And and as Andy said, we always remember what a terrible driver he was, but because so that's pretty much it. I wish I would have seen more of them growing up. But the distance, we do a once a week call back in the olden days for 5 minutes each child or something like that. But his research, he had his medical practice in his house, and my grandmother was his nurse, office manager, and everything else. And so she sort of ran the practice, and and he practiced medicine almost until the day he died. I think probably stopped 1 year before he died. And even when he was sort of making less money than the insurance premiums were. So he had a pretty full life here.
Yeah, and how did you learn about their background in Germany? Like how much and how early did you learn about, the fact that they had to leave Germany, the circumstances of their emigration? And then also, as a sort of second part of that question, when did you learn and what did you learn from them about his research work in Germany?
So, we knew the story of the family emigrating, including in the various stages, Poppy going first, then my dad and my grandmother, and then Michael, from a very early age. I mean, 10, 12, something like that. And, they would show that picture that you had and say, that's your father, that's your grandmother getting on the boat. And in terms of his research, I knew that he had done studies on twins and on Jewish twins. And I knew that his basement in Lake Grove, it was a small house, but it seemed like at the time like it had a big basement, contained all these piles of papers and smelled horribly like mildew. Veronica probably could attest that the mildew stayed with the papers, probably even today. And so,
I hope
we
not,
never
because
really
they're in the
talked about
LBI
that.
stacks.
Yeah.
Hopefully we did something about that, but I'm not an archivist, so.
But so we never really spoke about the research. Even the research I knew about, we didn't speak about. It was not of interest, I guess, to me as a teenager.
I mean, most grandparents probably don't.
And then,
after
Veronica got involved, I heard about it much the way Andy did on the thing, through Michael. And then I think I read one of Veronica's articles. And so that's basically the story there.
Well, thank you. And thanks for sharing, the story with us, both by donating your family's papers to the Leo Baeck Institute and participating in this podcast. John, I want to ask you a question about Nussbaum's research. You said something when we were preparing for this that I thought was interesting, that, the collection, when you learned about it, you said you were really blown away and surprised. But then you added that the part about the race science didn't surprise you at all. And so it's a sort of two-part question. What was it that surprised you and that you find unique about this collection and this story? And as someone who's written about the history of Jewish participation in race science, why didn't you find that part surprising? Because I think a lot of people do.
Okay, thanks for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure to be on this panel. What surprised me is, well, let me put it this way. Race science and the practice of race science within the sort of the larger orbit of biological sciences was not unusual. One can say that it began in the 18th century with the sort of what was really physical anthropology, and then in the 19th century it's still physical anthropology, but it's called race science, and it changes its name. But when I wrote on Jewish race scientists, pretty much all of them except for two were in the 19th century, and one of them carried on into the sort of early 20th century, and was also from Germany, and like Nussbaum was also a gynecologist. Perhaps Veronica might be able to say something if there's a link there. I'm not exactly sure that there is. It may just be a coincidence, but that was a man by the name of Felix Teilhaber, who wrote a sort of an important, somewhat alarmist book on race called Der Untergang der deutschen Juden, the demise of German Jewry, in 1911. And another one by the name of Ignaz Solzhenitsyn, who went into that period and actually challenged the Nazis to a public debate on the question of race. But generally speaking, that's what surprised me, is that Nussbaum's work carried on, during the Third Reich. And so it was late. It wasn't the nature of the work. It wasn't even the methodology that he employed, which was thorough. I think he did it was almost complete in terms of the the methodological underpinnings of race science of that day. Of course, he had his two teachers, Eugen Fischer and Ottmar von Verscheuer, were sort of the leading race scientists of the day. So he was very well trained. That's another thing that's surprising, of course, because he studied with them, but after 1933, he wouldn't have been able to study with them, and they became sort of doyens of Nazi race science. So I think, in a nutshell, it's the time that he dragged this on, and that the Nazis, of course, didn't shut him down immediately. That's also surprising to me, but perhaps it was a matter of wanting to get their hands on the research. So I would say it's the timing.
Well, Veronica, I guess two questions for you. First, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you discovered the story of William Nussbaum, what fascinated you about it, and then maybe you could get into that question that John just raised about why the Nazis would have tolerated this work by a Jewish scientist on a sort of central question of Nazi racial ideology.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm also very glad to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I was doing research for my PhD, and I wanted to work on the question how German life scientists with a Jewish background would write and think about race and heredity. And I had, of course, read John Ephron's book and also Mitchell Hart's book. And I thought these are great books, but I think something is missing here. I was not exactly sure what it was, but my impression was that there would be more, or I would be looking for people who were doing that work, that kind of research themselves, and not just writing books about it, as many medical doctors have done. But I really wanted to look whether there are people who were doing that research themselves. I found some, and I found some who all wanted to found an institution for race science or anthropology. Ignaz Zollshan was one of them as well, but there was also Franz Weidenreich, and all of them actually had, or Ignaz Zollshan had probably was closest to leaving Europe, but the others wanted to stay and wanted to have some kind of career within their own institutions. And I was just doing, I was looking into a book by Katz-Nielsen, Jews in German culture. And this is divided by chapters, and there's a chapter science and a sub-chapter Vererbungslehre, hereditary science. And there I found a little remark, Wilhelm Nussbaum, founder of the Working Group for Jewish Research on Genetics and Eugenics. And I was surprised because that name had never popped up anywhere. And so I typed that into Google. It was 2004. It was pretty early for doing Google searches. And the one thing that popped up was LBI archive collection. And I could also see that it was a really rich collection. And I could see that it was not yet sorted. It was not yet processed. And so I had planned a research stay in New York anyway at the LBI. And I said, wow, this is great. So I'm going to look at this. And I had no clue what would be in that collection. It was absolutely not, I would never have guessed that I would find this, because it very often historians have a dream of what the perfect source material would be for their work, but then they don't find it and they need to go and work with other sources. But this was just more than I could ever thought of. And it was actually too much to really make it the basis of my book. So I decided to have only one chapter. I was surprised by many things. I was so surprised that he managed to to get his institution established because the others were absolutely unsuccessful. Neither Weidenreich nor Zollshan were able to do this. It was only Wilhelm Nussbaum. And I think it was because he was extremely well connected, also through Lotte Nussbaum. One should not forget that. She was super well connected in Jewish Berlin. And I also think that this is a good question. Why wouldn't the Nazis shut that work down from the beginning? I think the Nazis hoped for, they hoped to be able to get hold on the material itself. I think that they thought, well, he's going to make a complete registry of all these interesting people that we then could have the data of, because it was very difficult for non-Jewish German scientists to do that kind of research. Eugen Fischer had several students who tried to do that and who all failed because the Jewish people would just not trust these guys. And so I think they just wanted the material. And in addition, I think that perhaps his supervisors, although they would not be his supervisors anymore, but I could imagine that his supervisors also threw in some words in his favor in order to convince the authorities that this would actually be a good thing to do.
So it's so there's so many directions to go, but maybe one thing we could explore a little bit is so John, your book was called Defenders of the Race, right? And it's about this idea that the Jewish community, in the early 20th century, late 19th century, was facing, processes that were larger social processes, but secularization, people moving away from Judaism, more mobility, people moving out of traditional communities and into cities, and there was a general anxiety about the sort of stability and health of the Jewish community as a whole. And, in keeping with the sort of ideas and discourse at the time, one of the lenses to view this through was race. So I'm wondering if you and then Veronica could maybe talk about the extent to which this sort of effort of someone like William Nussbaum was, animated by this desire to protect the Jewish community, both from these social forces that are threatening to, diminish it, but then also from the anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, racist ideologies that were also kind of gaining steam.
Well, there's no doubt that Jewish race scientists were motivated by anti-Semitism and the desire to respond to anti-Semitism, particularly in the 19th century. And by the way, Germany is not the only place there are Jewish race scientists. Right? They exist across Europe, and they ask different questions based on where they lived, and their own communities and their own social experience helped inform their science. The crucial question, the fundamental question that actually even existed as a statement, not as a question, but as early as 1775, with sort of the founder of physical anthropology, known by the name of Blumenbach in Germany. The fundamental question was, does inherited characteristics the result of sort of heredity, or can the environment change people, right? So, and the Jews were a perfect sort of sample group for this, because it was believed that Jews were an endogamous group who only married among themselves, but were spread all over the world. So the fundamental question is, if that's the case, and they therefore, in the language of race science, hadn't bred with other races, how is it that you get blonde, blue-eyed Jews, but then in, I don't know, Germany or in Sweden or in England, but then you get Middle Eastern Jews who are extremely dark, right, like their Arab neighbors. So the question is, and then the assumption, of course, is that Jews haven't mixed with anyone else. That's the fundamental assumption. So how is it that they all look, they look different? And then, of course, some scientists say, well, what you see is very superficial, and they actually do look alike, or they are alike. They have characteristics that are similar. But the thing about Jews is that they lead this diasporic existence. And so it allows you to test this question far and wide. Now, why I call the book Defenders of the Race is that almost all of the race scientists, this is a very important point about Jewish race scientists, all of them argued for the plasticity of human beings. All of them rejected the idea that there was the Jews had any sort of particular racial characteristics, and argued, in fact, for the environment as being the factor that determined what Jews looked like, acted like, etc., etc. And so one of the people who was, who's not a Jew, who's Jewish and Jewish scientist, but didn't work on Jews, was Franz Boas, who you mentioned before. Boas worked on Native Americans. He really didn't work on Jews, except he did one, to the best of my knowledge, one study on Jews, and he compared second generation Jews, young Jews, and Italians in New York City, all for the purposes of demonstrating how much taller, how much bigger in body shape, right, and body type, the children of immigrants were, because they had sort of better nutrition in the United States. They were, more sunshine. I don't know if they had more sunshine than the Sicilians did, but it doesn't matter. I mean, he argued that, and this change in environment, and it's absolutely true. I mean, the children of sort of Jewish immigrants are taller, are bigger than their parents from Europe. And he used this to sort of demonstrate that the key factor is the environment, right? And reject the idea of fixed characteristics. So that's what's behind Jewish race science, and that's why they defended themselves against the charges that they were a separate race.
So Veronica, does that also track with Nussbaum's views on race, and particularly who are the Jews, what are they as a racial category?
Yes, very much so. I would also agree that he embraced that research design that other Jewish scientists also embrace. We have the Jews spread all over the world, and thus they are the perfect group to look at. And he would very much hold the position that Jews have adapted so much to each environment they have been living in, and particularly in Germany. So all his work went into proving that the Jews were through and through a European group. And he would then even say they are a group, Bevölkerungsgruppe auf Deutsch, which is not race, not Rasse, right? And he would say they are hyper-Europeans, and they have been here for hundreds of years, and they have adapted very much, and thus they can't be called a foreign group. They can't be called foreign from Germany. I have only found very few Jewish scientists who would have subscribed to a very strong narrative of race, or a very strong concept of race that would argue for racial characteristic of Jews, or for not plasticity, but strong fixity of racial characteristics. Only very few, I think two. The great majority said we need to discuss the concept of race. It's not something we should simply adopt the way it is being used in race science. So they wanted to question the concept as it was used in Germany particularly, and I see him completely in this vein. And yet I think he was aware that many of his Jewish colleagues had a problem with the term race, because he advised a colleague in Hamburg who also wanted to found such an institute that he would never use the term race. Niemals von Rasse sprechen. Although I think for a scientist in Germany, it was completely normal to speak of human variation in terms of Rasse, because the term human variation simply did not exist back then, or was not that usual. But I'm fully with John when he says that there was a discourse at the time, and you could not easily leave that discourse. Otherwise, you would have been outside of the community of scientists. And so that is for sure. Franz Boas is super interesting in that regard, because the project that Wilhelm Nussbaum was pursuing once he was in the US was a physical anthropometry, an anthropometric project on orphan children, Jewish, Black and white, and the group was comparing X-ray measurements and body measurements, etc. Franz Boas did some anthropometric work. However, he always did it in order to prove the counterpoint of what the race scientists wanted to prove, right?
Yeah.
And this is something where Wilhelm Nussbaum and Franz Boas, I think, met very much. They wanted to use the same methods and prove different points and prove the opposite of what had been proven with that. And I think the only point where they diverged a little bit was on eugenics, but I think that for Wilhelm Nussbaum, when he emigrated, it was easy for him, and it was not necessary. How can I say that? It was for him very clear that eugenic was no longer something that he was interested in. I think that by that time, for various reasons, he dropped that idea completely. So, and so Franz Boas, I view as somebody who is particularly an opponent of eugenics and an opponent of race science if it is dedicated to the fixity of racial characteristics.
Can I just add one more point briefly? And that is, most race scientists, Boas is an exception, I don't know if he was really a race scientist, he was more an anthropologist, but, right. But most race scientists were physicians. And one of the things that Jews were not the only group who were the subjects of race science, but they were pretty much the only group who had so many physicians who knew the language and methodology of race science that they could speak precisely, as Veronica just alluded to, not outside of the canon, but they could actually adopt the canon, use the canon in order to argue with the dominant discourse of the canon. But you had to have medical training for that. So, in 1933, of course, 50% of the doctors in Berlin are Jewish, so for example, 16% nationwide. So, you have such an enormous number of Jews with the requisite scientific training that they can use, and the methodology at their fingertips, that they can then mount a case against race science by using race science. So.
Thanks. That's a really interesting point, and I think you mentioned that in our prep call, and I'm glad you brought it up again. And I think since we're a relatively small group, it would be great if anyone else in the audience has any questions, was able to listen to the podcast and wants to know more, or wants to react to something that's been said here already. I invite you to do so now. Maybe don't all speak at once, but you could use the participants list to, let's see, can you raise your hands or type something in the chat? Yeah, Peter.
Well, actually, so Veronica, one thing I wanted to ask was, so in the archives, there's all this sort of raw data, and then you've characterized my grandfather's goals and conclusions. Is that stuff also in the room? Because I've never, it was probably all in German, so I never could read it, but he wrote about his conclusions to others, and were they other scientists? Were they politicians? Were they friends? Did he publish a final paper?
Yes. There are a number of manuscripts in the collection. Super interesting. And there's one in English that was published after the war, with an anthropological journal, I forgot which one. It was the proceedings of a meeting in Brussels in the post-war time. And so that you can read. He summarizes everything very well. And still in Berlin, he tried to summarize the preliminary results in manuscripts for talks. He gave papers, and I think most of his papers were to Jewish institutions. They are in a simple language, not very scientific. But some of these manuscripts also rather address his colleagues who were also Jewish and also interested in anthropology. He was able to enroll quite a large number of these colleagues into what he wanted to establish as the Gesellschaft für jüdische Erbforschung later on. That institution never flew because it was stopped by the Nazis and he emigrated. But he had a long list of people who subscribed to be members of that society. And these were all doctors and scientists. So he had that kind of audience to speak to. But his main audience certainly were the Jewish institutions. And he had his mission there, right? He wanted to let these people know that there was hope and that the Jews had in fact never been an isolated group, but we're isolated now in this difficult situation, right? And with regard to isolated groups, I have recently worked on genetic studies of Roma, formerly called Gypsies, and they also were called in isolated groups all the time. They were also researched as an isolated group that is spread all over the world. They were even compared in that regard to the Jews. However, they do not have any doctors and scientists in their rank to speak about this genetic research or to oppose it or whatever. So it's interesting to see that this research is still ongoing. It's still a research which does not come from the Roma themselves, but is done on them in a very denigrating way. Is that the correct word? In a not nice way. And I think the term isolate or isolated group is still something the geneticists completely hang on to, although it very rarely makes sense. The Roma in Europe are no isolated groups. It's simply nonsense. And still for geneticists, it's such a nice word and a nice concept and easy for research designs to take.
John, your hand is up.
Yeah, I actually have a question for Peter, maybe Gloria as well. I was very intrigued by you saying that later in life, your grandparents became religious. Do you know why?
Yeah, Veronica actually may know better than I do, but I think my grandmother got sick, and after maybe she made a promise to God, but in the early 40s, and so then they became, I guess you could call it Orthodox. And my father and my uncle used to tell stories of them playing in the backyard in Kew Gardens and finding spoons and forks and knives because of in
the soil,
and so they I would say that they were they were important members of the Kew Gardens congregation in Lake Grove. I actually don't know if they were a member of a synagogue or not, but every day they would both read stuff, and they were sort of quite devout in their own home, let's say, and for as long as I knew them.
Well, I don't know why, but that's almost as surprising to me as just the fact of the science that he did, because they're not mutually exclusive, of course, but all of the race scientists that I studied were really quite secular, very Jewish. Obviously, that's why I looked at them, because they were sort of very Jewishly inclined and Jewishly affiliated in various ways, but I don't recall any of them being religious. So that's a very interesting
when they were in Germany,
development.
they were I think entirely secular.
Yeah, that's yeah.
I can only say what I have heard from your father, Peter. We did an interview with your father, and he said when Michael was not able to come over, then his mother suffered terribly, and after he arrived in the US, she or even while he was still away, she had developed a disease that made it impossible for her to swallow meals. And she would have terrible difficulties. She would throw up after each meal. If I'm sorry if that's not the correct term. And that was such a terrible condition for the whole family. Your father told about this, how terrible it was to see the mother suffering so much. And if I remember correctly, that was when she developed a very, very strong religiosity. And your grandfather, sorry, I always had the feeling that he was very spiritualistic or spiritual. He had a clue for spirituality. You might know better.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, he was very sort of spiritual is a good word. Yeah.
Yeah, and this you can be as a secular person as well. It combines well with secularity, actually.
Thanks.
I think you can also see that spiritual inclination in the large amount of poetry that is in the collection. He was had a very active literary interests and seems to go in a spiritual direction. Peter, I was wondering if maybe you could also, we've talked the most about your grandparents, but could you just tell us about your father and your uncle a little bit in short terms, that having been born
I think they were both, highly accomplished attorneys. They worked really hard. Michael was an absolutely wonderful man. He had a very sort of charismatic personality that drew people to him. He was always very interested in what other people were saying, and he was. I'm not doing him justice. He was just wonderful. My father, had different obligations, and including looking after his younger brother when Michael came over. And so I think he was a little bit less of a sort of a social animal than Michael. But he was a wonderful father. He was, the priority, as it probably was for them growing up, was, the first thing is family. The children's job is school. And my dad, when he wasn't working, he was with us, and it was he's a very sort of dedicated, both to his profession and to his family. And, but, Veronica, I think, could probably say more about Michael than I can, because she knows him in a way that's connected to this story.
Veronica, do you have any recollections of Michael you'd like to share?
I've a lot of wonderful recollections. Yes, he was a super wonderful person, and I don't think I can say more than Peter about him, but I'm missing him a lot.
Yeah, I know that colleagues from the Leo Baeck Institute also remember him very fondly.
I remember when we first met, that was an amazing moment for me, because I was still I had just finished my PhD, and then we talked on the phone, and obviously he had not known about his father's work, and I tried to tell him a little bit about it. And then he said, I must come to Berlin, I must meet you. And he came over and carried 2 suitcases full of letters from his parents, private letters. And then we sat in his hotel room for a week and did nothing else but reading letters. They were in German, and he was unable to understand German. So I was trying to translate as many letters as possible to him. And that is an unforgettable week for me. Absolutely. This is something that a historian makes a historian's life.
Yeah. If anyone, we have just a few minutes left. If anyone in the audience wants to say something or has a question. Gloria?
Yeah, I may have been muted, I think. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, I love Veronica. It's so nice to see you. Best wishes to your family. So Peter and I met in college in '82 at Amherst, and then he went to Yale Law School. We got married in '85. So I sort of got to know Poppy and Lydia a little bit in that time frame. But it's interesting over the generations to see, as much as I admire each generation for many, many reasons, how some of those traits pass down. And I see some of Poppy's traits that were in Bud and Michael, and now in Peter, and even in Daniel, who's kind of, off video. So it's nice to see those traditions and traits carry on through the family.
Receding hairline.
Yeah, more than that.
In Daniel?
Not Daniel yet.
Well, it's hard to imagine a sort of a better closer than that if we're talking about heredity and heritable traits. If there's one that we'd like to get to the bottom of, maybe hair loss and premature graying.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a good time to wrap it up. And again, thank you, Veronica, John, Peter, other members of the Nussbaum family, everyone else who's joined us here tonight. I wish we could, I think this story is so fascinating. We could sit here all night and talk about it, but we're about to go back to the Leo Baeck Institute dinner, where we'll hear a little bit more about the podcast and present an award to Amy Gutmann, the U.S. ambassador to Germany, who, if you didn't know, you might hear tonight, her father was also a refugee from Germany. So again, thank you all very, very much. And we'll close this breakout room now and rejoin everyone in the main zone.
Thank you very
Veronica,
much.
thanks for staying up late with us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Nice to see you, Veronica.
Bye.
Thank you. It was great to see you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Please like this video and subscribe for more content from the Leo Baeck Institute.